Welcome, friends, to the 2020 Memorial Day Commemoration of Remembrance in Wayne. I'm Douglas Stevenson. I have the privilege today of introducing our recorded program. Please carry the Memorial Day message into places that instill appreciation for the sacrifices that we commemorate today. Things are different this year. Although we stand apart and gather separately, we are still together in as much spirit as in other years. I do miss seeing you. I miss seeing the Marinacook Marching Band and hearing its music. And I miss seeing the veterans and children proudly marching through our streets. But our purpose today is still vitally important. Jerome Powell recently observed, "None of us has the luxury of choosing the challenges that we face. Fate and history provide those for us. Our job is to meet the tests that we are presented." Excuse me. This is as timely advice for us today as it was for those in the times that served who we honor today. Our program today consists of 3 uninterrupted segments, accompanied before and after by prayers from Angela Rotherham and Reverend John Olson. First, the flag raising ceremony, using the 2015 flag gift to the town of Wayne by Chris Ireland, who was then a colonel and commander of Joint Operations Aviation Component in Afghanistan. The second is the Memorial Day address, which will be offered by Will Ault, son of Lois Ault and Peter Ault, who now lives in Connecticut. And finally, the solemn wreath-laying ceremony into the waters of the mill stream along the shores of Pocasset Lake. Music today is provided by Dana Reynolds, and the audio was recorded on a day recently when the wind was so strong that it literally blew the words from her lips. We're honored also this year to have with us Bill Coolidge. Bill Coolidge is a Wayne family, and with 4 generations of military history going back to the Civil War. Bill himself served in the infantry in Vietnam and was stationed in Germany and elsewhere. We're happy to have Bill with us today because his Memorial Day duties in the past as a performance driver for the Shriners Go-Karts has kept him from being in Wayne, but we're glad he can be with us today. We've added 2 components to celebrate Memorial Day this year. One was to invite people to send personal reflections to the town office, which we will consolidate and prepare for a display in the future. The second one was to create a memorial banner in the Memorial Park from which we hang ribbons with the names of loved ones who served or died in the support of our freedoms. We'll leave this banner in place until the end of the month, so please add any names of any family members that you wish. In the segment of the program where we usually read the names of the veterans who have passed, I have knowledge of 2 this year. One was William Allen Chellis, who served in the Navy aboard the USS Wasp aircraft carrier. And one of his distinctions of service was that he was aboard the aircraft carrier when it recovered one of the Apollo spaceships. The second is Roger Olson, who served in the United States Air Force. And finally, let us pause today with respect, to remember those who fought, those who gave their lives, and for those who willingly stand today, ready to do the same when the defense of our freedom calls. We owe each of them the highest amount of gratitude, respect, and honor, and especially the assurance that their commitment to this nation's freedoms will never be forgotten. Thank you.
We typically gather in person to observe a tradition that began in 1866 following the Civil War, a service that honored the dead of both the Union and the Confederacy. In our time, Memorial Day is when we thankfully remember and honor those who have died during war in service to their country. While we cannot assemble safely this year, we can still pay solemn tribute to those who have served our nation in their time, helping to secure for us and our children the blessings of truth and freedom. On a personal note, I come from a long lineage of veterans. My father served in Korea for 18 months when I was just a baby. My uncle served in Vietnam. Both my grandfathers and my great-grandmother served in World War II. I can even go back to one of my great whatever grandfathers who served in the 5th Maine Regiment during the Civil War. This flag that is with me was the flag presented to my grandfather at the time of his mother's death, my great-grandmother, Frances Snyder. You see, this day means much to my family as well. So I invite you now into a time of prayer as we gather virtually to commemorate this Memorial Day. Will you pray with me? Almighty Creator and Sustainer of all life, we ask that your blessing may descend on us today. We seek to remember all those who gave their lives in service to their families, their friends, their country. We give you thanks for their lives, and we make a promise that those lives were not lived in vain, that we will stand together to create the peace and justice they sought, that we will work to create a world where giving one's life for one's country is no longer needed, where swords will be beat into plowshares, where all can be safe, where all will have enough. For those are the ideals our veterans died to provide and protect, and they are your intentions for all humanity. And so may we never forget those who made the supreme sacrifice so as to cure for our nation the blessings of life, liberty, and justice for all. May our observance be a timely reminder that our freedom was purchased at high cost and should not be taken for granted. Bless the families and friends of those we honor today. Bless those who served in action, those who served in support, those who served in preparing, and those who served with life and limb. We pledge to them, through you, that their sacrifices will be remembered, and that to honor them, we will work diligently for peace, so that our children may know a world without war. Amen.
Thank you, Reverend Angela, Doug Stevenson, and members of the Memorial Day Committee. Thank you for not letting this pandemic stop us from dedicating a few moments to our veterans. I really because of this digital environment, thought it would be best to just sort of have a conversation about some reflections I've had on why we would do this every year and pay tribute to our veterans. And I have to admit that I haven't really given it much thought, even though I have happily attended these at least past 55 years. So let me just take a few minutes and see if I can put it into words that that are similar to what I think are your motivations. One of them, I think, and probably this is one of the most important one, is to celebrate the higher purpose that called our veterans to do what they did. Now, I know many of you are students of our local history, and you know that there are many examples of Wayne veterans who were called to that higher purpose. From the shot heard round the world that we learned about at Wayne Elementary School, and through the world wars of the last century and up to the anti-terror mission in Afghanistan's today, there are plenty of examples. One of my favorites, and probably yours, is about a Wayne founder, a Minuteman, similar to my friend here, who 245 years ago, in March of 1776, before the Declaration of Independence was signed, decided to take on the #1 global superpower, of course, the British. Now, most people have characterized these Minutemen as untrained farmers with squirrel guns. They did do some training, as we all know. They were members of militias. And in this particular case, in March of 1776, these guys had the advantage of having some cannons that were taken from Fort Ticonderoga to take on the British at the height of their power. So who was this Wayne founder? Most of you know, at age 17, he joined General Washington. He was there with Henry Knox and those 51 cannon, courtesy of the Green Mountain Boys. And as we also learned at Wayne Elementary, those winter sleds that Knox put together. They set those cannons on a hill looking out over Boston Harbor, and our Wayne founder watched those guns drive the British fleet from the Boston Harbor. That same Wayne founder, a few months later in August of 1776, again followed General Washington down to New York to the hills of Brooklyn and Queens to take on the British. It's interesting that there's some diary accounts of the eve of the battle that confirm that this brand new Declaration of Independence was indeed read aloud to Washington's troops as they assembled on the eve of that Battle of Brooklyn. And of course, that declaration asserted, as we all know, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Our founder volunteered that day to take on the British, and it seems pretty clear to me that that declaration was the motivating force, because you know, you aren't going to take on 20,000 battle-seasoned British troops and German mercenaries with 10,000 farm boys unless you've got a pretty good motivation. And of course, as you all know, that Wayne founder was named Moses Wing. Here's a very, very brief account of the Battle of Brooklyn that August. So the battle began, and the Continental's Maryland militia tried to hold the line against a British force twice their size and was suffering hundreds of casualties. The experienced British generals ordered an attack of the left flank of the inexperienced colonial army. In the resulting crossfire, the Continentals had no choice but to flee for the East River or be cut to pieces. Moses Wing was there, and he was hit by a British cannon round in the leg. The British chased the Continental Army all the way to the East River until night fell. 1,000 Continental Army troops were killed, wounded, or captured. The British generals, though, decided to stop at the East River. They had Washington cornered, and they reasoned that there was no need to kill any more of these foolish rebels. These rebels had learned their lesson and surely would surrender in the morning when given the option or to face certain slaughter. And then late that evening, a mysterious fog descended upon the East River. Washington ordered his men to line up on the riverbank. They had a few boats, and they ferried all of them. It must have been a dozen or 15 trips to get them all across the river that night, and they all made it back just as dawn was breaking. He had, of course, ordered a few men to stay behind and keep the campfires lit. That's right. The only reason we're here, the only reason General Washington and Moses Wing escaped the British that night and were able to fight another day was this miraculous fog. Divine intervention, perhaps? So what about Moses? He was one of 50 severely wounded Continental Army soldiers who escaped that day. Somehow, he stayed up with the army that literally was running for their lives. He survived an amputation of that leg in an 18th century hospital surgery set up in a church in Fishkill, New York, and that church still stands. Moses learned from the surgeons who treated him, and he went on to serve in the Boston Revolutionary War hospitals and, as many of you know, became Wayne's first doctor. My point is, we can recognize Moses Wing's perseverance under such incredible circumstances, his perseverance, his service to go on despite his wounds. There are many examples in history, and let me just share another one from the Civil War. 85 years later, Wayne citizens were there again, volunteering. You know, I often think this is a war where you could be out on the battlefield, you're wounded, and we would all say, medic, medic, but of course, there were no medics in the Civil War. There certainly were none at Bull Run. There were no ambulance, no battlefield medicine in this great Civil War. And as we all know, no real sterilization of any surgical instruments. And another thing that's come to light recently is if you did survive the Civil War wounds, they had this new painkiller called morphine that was very effective. The only problem is it became a major affliction of the survivors of the war, and it was actually known after the Civil War as the soldier's disease. But let's talk about one of Wayne's veterans who was there. Lyman Richardson, a 27-year-old school teacher enlisted in Wayne as a second lieutenant in April 1861 in Company E of the 2nd Maine Regiment. He was the first Wayne man to answer President Lincoln's call for volunteers. Lyman was there at Bull Run, the first battle of the Civil War. Many of you probably remember Bull Run was the situation where 34,000 Confederates were just miles from Washington, D.C. and threatened to take the Capitol. Lincoln had assembled 30,000 Union volunteer troops. There was this Confederate general named Thomas Jackson, however, and he held the front line like a stone wall at Bull Run. And some unexpected Confederate reinforcements again hit the Union flank. The Union forces didn't have reinforcements. They retreated. Order broke down in the untrained troops, and they were literally routed in a retreat back to Washington, D.C. However, history records that Lyman Richards' Maine 2nd Regiment was one of the few regiments that somehow managed to stand their ground. They were the last regiment to leave the field. But what about Lyman? Lieutenant Richardson's leg was hit by a cannonball. Yes, it happened again. He was captured by the Confederates, and his leg was reportedly amputated without chloroform. He was carried on a stretcher back to Richmond, and he died in a Southern prisoner of war camp in Richmond in August. Surely, one of the higher motivations driving Lyman that day was the higher ideal to end slavery. He answered Lincoln's call to preserve the Union and end the evil of slavery. It's the same high motivation that we saw Moses Wing answer 85 years earlier. And we all know that on the Memorial Park plaque, there's further evidence of more recent Wayne veterans who were there and served in harm's way for a higher purpose to defeat the Axis allies. But what about today and how it relates to history? We know that the perils of this present epidemic would be very familiar to Wayne's veterans. We know that disease takes more soldiers than bullets. Smallpox was a greater threat to the Minutemen than the British. Dysentery killed over 95,000 Union Civil War soldiers alone. And yes, the flu epidemic of 1918 killed 45,000 US troops. But I think we all draw a parallel between those soldiers and many of the civilians who right now are following their example. Across the country, nurses, doctors, EMTs, ambulance drivers are risking their lives, not to mention the state policemen, the shelf stockers in our stores and the checkout clerks and the pharmacists, and of course the meat packers and the truckers. They are all following the example of our Wayne veterans of bravery. And I also would not be complete if I did not mention the other main reason we come here, and it's just to acknowledge the gratitude for their service that we must reflect on. It's not that hard to feel gratitude for our freedoms of speech and religion, for our rights to vote, our right to representation, our rights to a fair trial, our right to protection against unreasonable searches, our prohibitions against cruel punishment, our rights to bear arms, our rights to equal protection for all, no matter what our race, religion, or political views or sex. Surely, the veterans know that these rights are not free, and we all know that they are denied to many who do not have the good fortune to live in these United States. I think to close, the last thing that is important for us to remember is that we are better off if we follow their example. Aristotle, for example, said that the essence of life is to serve others and do good. Recent research proves that serving others is an amazing source of mental and physical health. The research shows that volunteers score consistently higher on surveys of life satisfaction. They have lower blood pressure, they live longer. But the studies indicate that it only works if you serve for the right reasons. The participants who volunteered lived longer, but only if their intentions were truly altruistic. They had to be volunteering to help others, not to make themselves feel better. We certainly know that the Wayne veterans were not going through their trials and tribulations to make themselves feel better. And we know how the Wayne veterans did it, and we can follow their example. We know how they persevered. They persevered because they were motivated by the ideals of the Declaration, by the ideals of Lincoln. And these are the highest ideals that we can seek and emulate. We too can be motivated to follow their example, to strive for service in the name of universally accepted high principles. We know that their example of service is the key to our own emotional, mental, and spiritual wellness. Thank you all.
us pray. Today we remember all those who have come before us and given the greatest gift to our nation, their lives. The duty of our veterans, past and present, is the fiber of the word freedom, and is stronger by our recognition of their service and sacrifice. Today, we honor that service and sacrifice and should carry it forward for our children to honor. Freedom and democracy are the result of the most honorable this country has produced. Today, we stand to remember the most honorable amongst us, and we must continue to carry the burden of their sacrifice, lest we lose sight of what true freedom is. Today is for remembering. Stand in honor of them. Walk in their path of duty. Remember the cost and hold in your heart the cause of freedom. We remember today, Memorial Day, our veterans. Amen.